Welcome to Raw Politik. Today we're joined by Gunness, former UNRWA spokesperson and long-time witness to the brutal reality of Israel's policies in Gaza. He's one of the few international figures who didn't just speak from press rooms, but stood at the heart of a besieged people's struggle and broke down on global TV when the world looked away. As the famine tightens its grip on Gaza, with the UN warning of imminent starvation, Israel has announced plans to occupy the strip indefinitely, all while refusing to open key crossings and deliberately obstructing aid. Meanwhile, at The Hague, the ICJ just heard arguments about whether Israel has the legal obligation to allow life-saving humanitarian access, with the United States siding with Israel against that obligation. Let that sink in. Let us welcome Gunness together. So Chris, let's start with the case that just wrapped up at the ICJ. So Israel is accused of deliberately blocking humanitarian aid to a starving population. And the US has argued that they have no legal obligation to allow that aid in. You've worked inside the system. What does this ruling and the US position reveal about international law in the face of genocide?
Well, first of all, the US position is palpable nonsense. Israel does have an obligation, not just as the occupying power, which says that the occupying power has a responsibility towards the protected population, i.e. the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but also the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. But what we're seeing now is a much more joined up approach. So the ICJ is saying that Israel is committing a plausible genocide, arguably, that the rights of Palestinians, because of genocidal behavior, arguably, plausibly, are being denied, are being violated. So the ICJ is effectively saying what the ICC is saying too, which is that Israel is accused of using food as a weapon of war. And here I think is something very important going on, and that is we're seeing increasingly that the dots of international and national accountability mechanisms joining up. You've got the ICJ, which, excuse me, as you say, has just concluded this case, saying quite clearly that Israel has an obligation, and that is an undeniably, it's a legal obligation. But we're seeing those obligations reinforced both in national jurisdictions, where there's universal jurisdiction cases being held against members of the Israeli army, but also at the ICC, which has issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, and the ICJ, which is seized not just of the question of the aid in Gaza and the West Bank, but also in terms of the illegality of the occupation. So as I say, although I think things are desperate, I think we're seeing unprecedented levels of both genocidal criminality by Israel and also complicity by UN member states. And I think that's very bad news for Israel, for the Palestinians, for the Middle East, and for all of us. But as I say, I think more and more we're seeing accountability mechanisms being used in a much more joined up and sensible way.
No, absolutely. And there is a glimmer of hope. The issue with these accountability mechanisms is that they are just taking too long and they're unable to stop the actual starvation of children and families in Gaza. And this is about the deliberate obstruction, using starvation as a weapon of war. So you've been on the ground for many years. Can you walk us through how Israel's control of border crossings, inspections, and coordination mechanisms actually function as weapons of war?
Well, first of all, there's a military occupation. So the Israeli army has built a wall, a fence, call it what you will, a ring of steel around Gaza and actually around the West Bank also. So there is a physical barrier through which people and goods, that means aid workers and humanitarian products, and by the way, imports and exports in and out of Gaza, which should be happening, those are all effectively physically blocked. Now, when you want to get into Gaza, the UN is forced to do what they laughably call coordination, as if there was a two-way coordination process that goes on. It's a complete misnomer. The UN, UNRWA, for example, that I used to work for, in those days, of course, UNRWA has now, by the Knesset, effectively been declared illegal, but UNRWA would have to apply to the Israeli army for permits for the number of trucks that would go in every day. The Israelis would want to know what's in the trucks. They'd want to inspect them. There were more and more hurdles being put in the way because Israel says it has legitimate security concerns. But of course, since time immemorial, frankly, since 2007, when the blockade was imposed in earnest, much was done in the name of Israel's security, which, frankly, from where we stood in UNRWA, was a delaying tactic. Frankly, it was a collective punishment. So that's what happens with goods. You have to get permission for the trucks to go in. And once they've got in, that coordination, this misnomer, is further used. UNRWA would have to tell the Israelis the exact GPS coordinates of where all of the aid trucks and vehicles would go, and it would give Israel on a regular basis the GPS coordinates of every single UNRWA installation. Israel has all of that. So when it says, oh, we mistakenly hit an UNRWA school, that is nonsense. They have the precise GPS coordinates of every UNRWA school, of every UNRWA warehouse, of every UNRWA health clinic. They know all they need to know to avoid this. So the coordination is then from the GPS coordinates where everything is going. And then as far as people are concerned, you have to apply, first of all, for a visa to get into Israel. Now, of course, Israel, as the occupying power, does not have legal jurisdiction over what can go in, people going in and out. There is an obligation, as I say. Nonetheless, they have illegal and illegitimately imposed on the UN system this framework by which the UN had to apply for permits for people to get into Israel, Palestine, and then into Gaza itself. So it's a system of total control. At a certain point, Israel had this frankly Nazi-esque system whereby the red line system, whereby they turned the needed calorific intake of people in Gaza into the number of trucks, and they would simply allow that number of trucks in. It didn't take into account what more you need: fresh food, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, fresh meat. It was just about calculating the calories that children, women, pregnant women need in Gaza per day and multiplying that by the number of trucks. Frankly, it was a Nazi-esque system, and it's appalling that it was ever used. But that is what the blockade and the occupation consists of today. Of course, nothing has been allowed in since the 2nd of March, and Israel boasts about this in the international system. So what you have now is UNICEF, the UN's children's agency, saying that children are going to die of starvation. You've got other UN agencies, the World Food Programme, saying they're blocked, that malnutrition has already broken out. People would die of starvation. The health system has been bombed to pieces by Israel. So even when children become malnourished, there was nowhere for them to be seen by doctors. And so many aid workers, medical staff, nurses have also been directly targeted. We know that. So we have a system where there's a blockade, it's a physical, but actually it's frankly a collective punishment. And even after that collective punishment has been imposed and people are now starving to death, there is not adequate medical care, housing, hospital facilities, water, pharmaceuticals, you name it, the water system, the agricultural system, the land. There's environmental catastrophe in Gaza. There's no way this can be described as anything else but a deliberate genocide. The attempt by a member state of the United Nations, and it's live streamed every day on our television, to destroy in whole or in part the Palestinians. And we're seeing it not just in Gaza, we're seeing these aerial assaults on refugee camps, on civilians in the West Bank as well. The world knows very well what's going on. And yet, in spite of the fact that the International Court of Justice has said that the occupation is illegal, it's illegal because it denies the Palestinians the right of self-determination. In spite of that, in spite of the fact the ICJ has said there can be no complicity with this illegal occupation, no economic support, no diplomatic support, no military support, no economic, no financial, no cultural, no nothing, is what the great British barrister Philippe Sands said at the ICJ. And in spite of that, member states such as the Americans, the Brits, the Europeans, all the different European states have carried on with business as usual with Israel. And this makes them complicit with genocide, and it needs to end. And not just are they complicit in genocide, they are actually moving against those who speak up. We're seeing people of conscience in America, in Europe, in Germany, in France, in the UK. We're seeing the authorities moving against them in the name either of anti-Semitism. You're an anti-Semite if you speak out and say that Israel is committing a genocide, or in terms of national security. Palestinians, of course, and their supporters are terrorists, therefore we need to lock them up. It's an absolute disgrace, but history will judge them very, very harshly. Though, as Francesca Albanese, the great UN human rights rapporteur, has said, we don't want history to judge them. That's too late. We want them to be judged now.
Yes, and we will judge them. And you have described a very painful picture of the existential threat facing Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. I want to turn to UNRWA. And you are someone who was deeply embedded in UNRWA for years, and you have witnessed the literal and political attack on the organization. How do you interpret those attacks? As I talk about this existential threat to Palestinians, how are the 2 points connected?
Well, to be clear, it's an existential threat, specifically the attack on UNRWA. It's an existential attack on the Palestinian refugees. UNRWA serves about 6 million, possibly a bit more, Palestinian refugees around the Middle East and Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. And of course, they all are guaranteed. They have the right of return, guaranteed by UN resolutions. And the UN has an historic responsibility to make sure that all the rights of the Palestinian refugees, not just the right of return enshrined, not least in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the UN has an obligation to have all of those rights, including the right of return respected. And what Israel foolishly and without any legal basis believes is that if you get rid of UNRWA, you somehow get rid of the Palestinian refugees. But of course, UNRWA could stop existing right now, but the 6 million refugees would continue to be human beings. They would continue to be refugees with rights. So you can magically, or through an act, both of the Knesset, 2 bills in the Knesset, but through this smear campaign against UNRWA, these baseless allegations against UNRWA, you can attack UNRWA, you can do everything you can to defund UNRWA, which of course, all of which is going on. But if, as I say, UNRWA disappeared, the refugees would remain human beings, each individual with a dignity and a destiny and a broad range of individual and group rights that have to be respected. So it's a Zionist delusion of Israel thinks that it can suddenly magically get rid of these people, but that's what the attack on UNRWA is all about. It will never succeed. It will never succeed unless Israel thinks it can actually kill 6 million, a figure that chills the hearts of many. If they think they can somehow kill or get rid of 6 million refugees, of course they can't, but they're trying very hard. There is this, as I say, this genocidal assault. Many UN experts and rapporteurs will say that it's a genocide. Many legal scholars have said, Israeli, Jewish, scholars of the Holocaust and of genocide all around the world are very clear that what we're seeing is a textbook genocide. And of course, Amnesty International has issued a 300-page report, both in terms of the empirical data, but also the legal analysis. And it's very clear there is a genocide going on. And, increasingly I say to people, do not deny the genocide, in the same way that I say to people, do not deny the Holocaust. Holocaust denial is disgraceful. It's disgusting. It should be stamped on wherever possible. Genocide denial is also disgraceful, disgusting. It should be stamped on wherever possible. We're seeing women and children since the ceasefire ceased. We've seen over 1,000 people killed, including over 400 women and children in Gaza. We're seeing it on our screens every day. Everyone on this planet has an obligation to speak out against the crime of crimes. We all have an obligation to speak out against this live-streamed genocide.
Well, Kristen, I think the Israeli government are not making it a secret that that's what they intend to do.
No, sorry, Mary. If I can just say, one of the things, I work on Myanmar, and one of the things that we had to do with the Myanmar genocide is prove there was genocidal intent. So the junta, Aung San Suu Kyi and others were saying, we just drove these 750,000 people out. Okay, it may have been ethnic cleansing, but it wasn't genocide. But then when we started to look at what they were saying on Facebook and in their public pronouncements, it was very clear that what the junta in Myanmar was saying was genocidal. Well, exactly the same thing has happened in this case. If you look at the brilliant South African presentation on I think it was in January last year at the ICJ, they had pictures of Netanyahu and others invoking the Amalek genocide from the book of Samuel in the Bible, in which the prophet is told, go and kill all the Amalekites, go and kill their women, their children, the babies, their livestock, just wipe them out totally. Netanyahu invoked the Amalek genocide. And then in the ICJ, we had pictures of IDF soldiers doing the sort of Jewish dancing around in a circle thing and chanting this genocidal injunction that's in the Bible. Well, what more proof do you need? You have the commander-in-chief, Mr. Netanyahu, saying, go and commit a genocide. And you've got the IDF soldiers on the ground saying, we are committing genocide. What more proof do you need that a genocide's going on?
No, absolutely. And I was going to just talk to you now about this annexation. So yesterday, the Israeli government approved a plan to take control of the Gaza Strip as if they're not already in control, not for days or weeks, but indefinitely. So how do you interpret this in the context of the ongoing ICJ proceedings that you've already discussed? And is this not de facto annexation dressed up in military language?
It is annexation, but to be clear, it's illegal. The world will, in the form of the General Assembly and any other UN body that cares to pronounce upon it, will not and cannot accept it as illegal. It'll be one of those things like, the annexation of East Jerusalem. Here you have a city, Palestinian part of East Jerusalem, should I say, annexed. It's been annexed for decades. The world continually says it's illegal, it shouldn't be happening, blah, blah, blah. But somehow it's accepted. And my concern is, although the annexation of Gaza and indeed the West Bank, which they openly say they're doing, may become a de facto fact on the ground, it will simply increase the illegitimacy of the Zionist project. If what we're seeing is colonialism taking over more and more and more of Palestinian land, what we're seeing is the illegal settler colonial enterprise being further entrenched on the ground. And all that does is further entrench illegality. It will see the further marginalization, the further demonization of Israel. It will lead to further instability, certainly amongst the Palestinians. I mean, no Palestinian is going to roll over and just accept the annexation of their land. There will be a reaction to it. I imagine that there will be some kind of reaction to it further afield. I think there will be acts of anti-Semitism against Jews. I think that there will be further instability across the Middle East. We already saw a couple of days ago a Houthi missile slamming in near to Ben Gurion Airport. And I think we're going to see further of those sorts of attacks. I think we'll see further counterattacks, or attacks, should I really say, by Israel. We saw what's going on in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza. It's gonna make the Middle East an inherently a more unstable place. So Israel can go ahead with these things. They've got military might on their side. It's going to lead to an uptick in illegality and a violent reaction to illegality. It is in no one's interest, not least of all Israel's. If Israel thinks it can somehow guarantee its security by taking over further and further, larger and larger swathes of Palestinian land in Gaza and the West Bank, it is fatally mistaken. History will show that to be an irredeemably stupid thing to do.
To what extent, though, do you see this Gaza plan as a political survival strategy on the parts of Netanyahu?
Oh, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the continuation of the war in any guise, and there's no doubt in my mind that the military annexation of Gaza will lead to further war. That is absolutely in Netanyahu's interest. It's been said repeatedly, and I think it's undeniably true, that when and if peace ever comes, Netanyahu will be frog-marched off to court to face corruption charges and is possibly looking at the end of his political career. So what we're seeing is the man who can make the war be prolonged have an interest in making sure that war is prolonged. And that is, the many Israelis I speak to, it's a matter of deep, deep regret to them that what's being done in their name, genocide, annexation, all of these illegalities are leading to their marginalization. The International Court of Justice is very clear. There can be no complicity. There can be no financial support for Israel, economic, political, diplomatic, etc. So, the consequences of this, I think, are violent. It'll lead to more instability. I think it'll lead to more starvation. I mean, the idea when armies take over aid, it always leads to humanitarian disasters. We've seen what happened in Gaza, where, the army, remember the bread queue massacre? Was it in March, April last year, where the Israeli army decided it was going to start delivering aid either itself or through its proxies, and it led to massacres. And I think that we're going to see more and more of that as we see the further militarization by Israel of humanitarian aid. It's a disaster. It shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Chris, you mentioned the armies taking over aid, but I'm hearing in policy circles that there's talk of this post-war Gaza reconstruction led by regional actors and or private entities. Are you privy to these conversations?
Well, I know a little bit about them, and you probably know much more than I do, to be perfectly frank. But again, these private corporations are usually run by military people who've taken off their uniforms and have put on an aid worker's tunic. I mean, don't be fooled by that. But what I would say is, who's going to pay for this? Do you really think that the usual suspects, so we're talking Scandinavian countries, the Japanese, the Middle Easters, are they really yet again going to pay for the rebuilding of Gaza when, for the umpteenth time, Israel has destroyed it? And the destruction is so much worse this time. 70, 80% of all the housing stock completely destroyed, all universities completely destroyed, the majority of schools completely destroyed, arable land completely destroyed. There's an ecocide going on, hospitals destroyed. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There are over 50 million tons of rubble in Gaza. And by the way, unexploded ordnance. After the 2014 war, where I was working for UNRWA, they said that 10% of everything that flew in to Gaza remained unexploded. Well, what we've seen dropped on Gaza is, many times Hiroshima. Think of 10% of several Hiroshimas. That's got to be demined. Now, the UN Mine Action Service went in after 2014. It took them months and months and months to demine Gaza. What we've seen in the last year and a half is way worse than what we saw in 2014. So, there's a massive amount that has to be done in terms of demining, rubble clearance, and then, reconstruction. Meanwhile, the people whose homes, businesses, factories, etc., are being rebuilt, they've got to be housed, they've got to be fed, there's got to be medical facilities for them. There's a massive, massive undertaking, the sort that the world has rarely ever seen in the past, and it's going to be hugely expensive. Now, without security guarantees, do you really think that this is going to come to anything? Do you really think that, MBS and others are going to suddenly start paying to mop up after Israel has just committed a genocidal assault on Gaza? I think there are real question marks about that.
You've spoken extensively about complicity and repression in the West. What would a principled international response look like? What should government institutions and movements be doing to resist the situation?
Well, if you look at what the lawyers say, it's very clear. I recommend all of your viewers, listeners, to dig out the deposition to the ICJ by Philippe Sand and also by Ralph Wild, two British legal scholars who made presentations. And they were very clear. It's very clear what member states have to do. They have to cease all complicity, that's all support, not just in terms of what comes out of occupied Palestinian territory, but Israel itself, because it's very clear that Israeli taxpayers, the businesses, whatever goes on in Israel itself, funds this illegal occupation. So we've now got to the point where if member states are going to take a principled position, and that's what you've asked me about, they have to have a total blockade of Israel. And, there can be no complicity with this illegal occupation. So there can be no diplomatic support, no military support, no financial support. They also have to make sure that entities within them, so nationals, so businesses and other entities, universities, whatever, are not themselves complicity. Now, Norway, for example, has issued guidelines and has said this is what you need to do to get on the right side of the law. And what I would like to see is other governments on the planet, other UN member states, issuing guidelines to start with at least and go further to make sure that they and their entities operating in their jurisdictions are on the right side of the ICJ's legal opinion. That would be a very first good step, a principled step. Of course, it has to go further. We have to make sure that the occupation ends by September. That's what needs to happen. It's a very tall order, but that's what the ambition should be by member states of the United Nations if they want to act in a principled manner.
Very clear, Chris, on third state responsibility.
I mean, the law is very clear. There's no getting around it. You're either acting illegally or you're not acting illegally. That's the great thing about the ICJ's opinion. It makes it very clear what member states have to do to get on the right side of the law. Simple.
What about humanitarian organizations? What should they be doing?
Well, that's a really tough one. I mean, let's start with UNRWA. I would like to see much more defense of UNRWA. I think UNRWA has done an extraordinary job. I'm very proud to have served in UNRWA. And I think that the colleagues that I left behind have done an extraordinary job in risking their lives, frankly. And we're talking about both internationals. And of course, let's not forget that UNRWA employs 30,000 Palestinians around the Middle East, not just in Gaza. And I would like to see those member states that have taken part in both a smear campaign against UNRWA, a campaign to delegitimize UNRWA, a campaign to defund UNRWA. They need to come back. They need to understand that in failing to support UNRWA, they have, as they have done, they've been on the wrong side of history. I think people are now regretting what they did. I mean, Britain defunded and held out for a long time. It was disgraceful. I was utterly ashamed that my own government withheld funding on the basis of nothing. I mean, let's be clear. Israel told the mother of all lies. There was no evidence that UNRWA staff took part in the October attacks, none whatsoever. Those workers, in my view, should never have been sacked. We should have demanded that Israel gave us the evidence. But of course, UNRWA was put under huge pressure. And I think the Commissioner General had no choice in the interest of the agency, as he put it, to sack these people. I think that other Commissioner Generals might not have done that. But, let's not go into that. The fact is, huge financial pressure was put on UNRWA. They were basically told, if you don't get rid of these workers, then we're going to defund you. Of course, in a way, it was naive because they did get rid of the 12, was it 12, whatever, the number of workers that were accused falsely of being part of the attack. And then the donors defunded anyway. So that was perhaps naive. And the Americans have not come back, even though the Colonna report, the independent investigation into UNRWA's alleged complicity and involvement in the attack, found that Israel produced no evidence whatsoever. So on the basis that Israel has produced no evidence, I think that member states need to come back very quickly and support UNRWA. They need to put maximum pressure on Israel to reverse the two Knesset bills. They must not be implemented. Okay, they're passed, but the question is, are the authorities going to have them implemented? They should not be implemented. UNRWA staff should be granted visas. The UNRWA headquarters in Jerusalem, the huge 10-acre compound, I don't think that should ever have been abandoned. I don't think that UNRWA should have retreated from that. I think that it should have been handed over to other UN agencies. They were all very timid, of course. They didn't want to because they were frightened of what Trump and the Americans might do to them. But there was such a lack of leadership at the senior level within the UN. I'm talking here about Guterres's office. The Secretary General should have done much more to make sure, he'd come from UNHCR, for goodness sake. He should have done much more to make sure that the humanitarian system as a whole stood four square behind UNRWA and didn't allow the retreat, from the UNRWA headquarters in Jerusalem. And it should have been much, much more firm in the defense of UNRWA, because what we're now seeing is the Israelis trying to cherry pick the different agencies, trying to get the World Food Programme to take over UNRWA's food distributions in Gaza, to take over UNRWA's food distribution centres, its warehouse, etc., to get others to take over the schools, WHO to take over the health clinics. But of course, bottom line is only UNRWA has, start of the war, 12, 13,000 workers. The other agencies have just a few hundred staff. They're dwarfed when you look at what UNRWA has. And as people have said continually, including Guterres, the Secretary General, UNRWA is the backbone of any humanitarian response. You cannot cherry pick. You cannot go to the other agencies and say, do this, do food, do health. Only UNRWA has the infrastructure, the vehicles, the staff, the warehouses, the schools, the vehicles. Only UNRWA can provide what is needed for a humanitarian response to the genocidal starvation that we are now seeing in Gaza. And the member states need to recognize this.
Yeah, what's coming to mind, Chris, as you speak about, the disinformation campaign against UNRWA is the media complicity in this, because the media was just repeating the Israeli lies of, UNRWA's role on October 7th. So I want to turn to media complicity with you. Having spent 2 decades, am I right, at the BBC, how do you perceive the role of the mainstream media in shaping understanding of conflict like Gaza and Myanmar, if you want to take it wider? And talk to us about these systemic biases that we are seeing that have allowed for this to happen, really.
Mary, I have to say that as someone who's worked with the media and in the media for 40 years of my life, and as someone who's been doing public advocacy for UNRWA, it ill behoves someone like me to accuse the BBC or CNN or even the New York Times with complicity. I mean, I think that there are some regrettable editorial decisions that have been made. I think that this question of balance is being used by the Israelis to intimidate people like the BBC. So you will often get, we now have to go to such and such an Israeli spokesman, even though we know that what they're putting out is complete lies. I mean, would you go to the Flat Earth Society if you were having a conversation about the shape of the world? I think not. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of the coverage of Gaza. We're seeing the Israeli army, Israeli spokespeople being shown, demonstrably shown to be lying. And yet time and time again, the mainstream news organizations, I think, are browbeaten. They're frightened of the Israelis. In my day, it was Mark Regev who used to phone them up and make it very clear that there would be consequences, would threaten, would try to intimidate. But of course, I remember the disinformation that was spread by Mark Regev, the lies, frankly, he put out. Journalists in 2014, when our schools were hit, would say to me, Mark Regev said that there were militants inside it. And yet after the 2014 war, of course, at the time when it was going on, UNRWA didn't have the staff or the capacity while there were bombs raining down on these unarmed humanitarian workers. We didn't have the capacity to check what Mark Regev was saying. But later on, there was a board of inquiry. Everything he said about militants in the schools, complete nonsense. The same with the killing of these aid workers and the burying of their vehicle. It turned out Israel did it, knew about it, tried literally to cover it up. They buried all the evidence and then lied about it. And yet we feel we have to, or the BBC and others feel that they have to, have this kind of balance. I totally get it. I worked at the BBC for 25 years. I totally understand why they have to do that. But let's be clear, they are under huge pressure from the international Zionist movement, Israel and its proxies around, including organizations in this country that are putting huge pressure on the BBC and other organizations. And I think in the face of those pressures, the BBC does a pretty creditable job. Yes, there are editorial decisions which I would not necessarily agree with, but I tend to be, if you'll forgive the expression, I tend to adhere to the cock-up theory of history rather than conspiracy theories. I think things happen often in organizations because journalists make mistakes, pressures are put on certain journalists, they come out in the wash in different ways. And also, I don't think, Mary, that the likes of you and me certainly should make enemies in the media. I think all journalists should be our friends because ultimately we're going to tell the narrative, not just our narrative, but the Palestinian narrative through these media outlets. So yes, when I see often things on the TV, I read, I mean, the New York Times, it's just a kind of Zionist parish magazine often. And I read it and think, oh my goodness, you know, what editor allowed this to go through? On the other hand, you read some amazing reportage in the New York Times. So, I mean, yes, there is huge pressure, I think, on these big organizations to toe the Israeli line. Often that's what comes out. But the likes of you and me need to make these news organizations our best friends. And we have to work with them to change the way that the narrative is portrayed, rather than stand outside and scream abuse at them, because I don't think that's in our interests whatsoever.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for your insight. Is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap up, Chris?
I think, you know, my takeaway from this is the utter indomitability of the Palestinian spirit, that you can do what you like to them. I mean, I've worked with Palestinian children. You know, if you put your faith in Palestinian children in places like Gaza, they will never let you down. And I feel the more and more I see this stuff, the sort of humanity within is what I think continually shines out from Gaza. That's one of the profound ironies, that in the face of the utter barbaric, genocidal inhumanity of this colonial Zionist project, we see from many Palestinians, particularly the women, the children, the aid workers, an extraordinary humanity shining back. And somehow, destroyed as I am, and destroyed as many people are by what's going on, that is a shining light and a hope we all have to cling to very dearly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's so beautiful. Chris, thank you for being with us today.
Sure. It's my pleasure.